An internal police review says 13 women went missing from Vancouver's downtown Eastside after the city's police force first forwarded information about Robert Pickton to the RCMP in Coquitlam, including 11 later linked to Pickton's Port Coquitlam farm.
There were errors made in a number of different places.
The 450-page document prepared by the Deputy Chief of Vancouver Police blames both forces for errors that prevented either from arresting Pickton until 2002, years after officers first started looking at Pickton as they investigated reports of missing.
On February 5, 2002, police drove onto a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, with a warrant that had nothing to do with murder. They were there because of illegal firearms. A former worker had told police that. Robert William Pickton, a local pig farmer known to some people as Willie, had guns in his trailer, and that was enough to get officers through the gate of a property that had been whispered about for years. So they entered the farm, walked toward the trailer, and began searching the cluttered rooms where Pickton had lived for years. At first, the search gave them what they expected. They found weapons. They found items that matched the warrant. But then, inside that same trailer, among the ordinary mess of a farm property, officers noticed an asthma inhaler. And when they looked closer, they saw a name attached to it. Serena Abbotsway. That name changed everything. Serena was not supposed to be there. She was one of the women who had disappeared from Vancouver's downtown Eastside, a neighborhood where families had spent years asking why their daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends were vanishing without answers. For years, women on the streets had warned each other to be careful. For years, families had told police their loved ones would not simply disappear. For years, names had been added to lists, posters had been printed, tips had been given, and rumors had moved through the downtown east side that someone was taking women and no one in power was moving fast enough. And now, one of those names had appeared inside Robert Pickton's trailer. At that moment, the search stopped being about guns. It became about the women, almost 50 women who had vanished from Vancouver's downtown east side through the 1990s and early 2000s. And what police found after that would turn Robert Pickton's farm into one of the largest crime scenes in Canadian history. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. Robert Pickton's story started far away from the courtroom, far away from the headlines, and far away from the farm search that would later make his name known across Canada. It started in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia in 1949. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24th of that year to Leonard Francis Pickton and Louise Helene Arnold Pickton. His family owned a pig farm, and that farm became the center of almost everything in his early life. It was where he grew up, where he worked, where he learned how animals were raised, sold, and processed, and where the line between childhood and labor seemed to disappear very early. Robert had an older sister named Linda and a younger brother named David. But Linda did not grow up on the farm in the same way the boys did. She was sent away to live with relatives because the family believed a pig farm was not the right place for a young girl to be raised. So Robert and David stayed behind, and from a young age, their lives were shaped by the same routine almost every day. There was school, but before school there was farm work. Then after school there was more farm work. They fed animals, cleaned, helped with chores, and spent long hours around the smell and mess of livestock. And Robert did not fit easily anywhere else. At school, he struggled. He had trouble learning at the same pace as other children, and according to later accounts, he was placed in special education classes after falling behind. He was quiet, socially awkward, and often isolated. He did not have many friends, and his appearance made things worse. Because he worked on the farm before and after school, he often arrived dirty, smelling strongly of the animals and the property, and other children noticed. So they mocked him and called him Stinky Piggy. There was also a family claim that Robert's birth may have involved a lack of oxygen because the umbilical cord had been wrapped around his neck. But that should be understood only as something the family reportedly believed, not as a medical explanation for what he later became. Then came one of the childhood stories that appeared again and again in accounts of his early life. When Robert was around 11 or 12, he had a pet calf. He loved that animal, and the calf became something he cared about deeply. He would come home and look for it, he fed it, and it was one of the few attachments that seemed to matter to him. But one day he came home and could not find it. He asked where the calf was, and he was told to check the barn. So Robert went to the barn, and there he found the calf had been slaughtered. It was a moment that people would later point to as painful and formative. But the farm was only one half of the story. The other half was waiting 27 kilometers away, in Vancouver. So, one of the earliest stories people pointed to did not begin with Robert at all. It began with his younger brother, David. David had just started driving, and like many teenagers with a new license, he wanted to take the family vehicle out. He drove near the farm in Port Coquitlam, close to the same roads the family had used for years. But during that drive, something went wrong. David struck a young boy named Tim Barrett near the edge of the road. For David, the moment seemed to turn into panic almost immediately. Instead of staying there, calling for help, or bringing an adult to the scene in a proper way, he drove back to the farm. He went to his mother, Louise, and told her what had happened. But Louise did not react like a mother hearing that a child outside the family might be badly hurt. She reacted like someone whose first concern was keeping the problem inside the family. Then she told David what to do with the vehicle, and then she went back toward the road herself. Tim Barrett was still there and had not died at the moment David hit him. But Louise moved him away from the road and into a water-filled ditch where he later died. Afterward, the death was treated as an accident, and David faced juvenile proceedings. But Louise was never charged in connection to what she had done, and Robert grew up with a lesson that would have been hard to miss. One could easily get away with murder. By 1963, Robert Pickton had left school behind. He was only a teenager, but school had never worked for him, so he found work as a butcher's apprentice. He understood the practical side of raising livestock and preparing meat, and he learned the trade in a way that matched the only skills he seemed comfortable with. And after several years, he left the apprenticeship and returned full-time to the family farm. So Robert's life stayed tied to pens, barns, trailers, machinery, and livestock. And because it was a working pig farm, there was always waste to deal with. The parts of animals that could not be sold or used had to be removed from the property, so Robert would load the waste into barrels and drive toward Vancouver to dispose of it at a rendering facility called West Coast Reduction. But those trips gave him something he did not have on the farm. It gave him a reason to leave Port Coquitlam, a reason to enter Vancouver without anyone questioning why he was there. So Robert would drive from the pig farm toward the city, drop off the animal waste, and then drift toward the downtown Eastside, where the streets were different from the quiet, muddy land he came from. And in Vancouver, he could become someone else for a few hours. He started spending time around the Low Track, a stretch of the downtown Eastside known for poverty, addiction, and street-based sex work. It was a place where people were struggling, and where many women were trying to survive one night at a time. And Robert had something that gave him attention. He had cash, and in that part of the city, cash could open doors that his personality never could. He could offer money, he could offer drugs, he could offer a ride, a place to go, or a promise of more once they got away from the street. Some women saw him as odd, but not necessarily dangerous at first. He was dirty from the farm, and awkward in the way he spoke, but he was also known to pay. And for women living under pressure, a man who paid could look safer than a man who threatened. So his routine began to take shape. By day, Robert worked the farm, then he drove toward Vancouver. And it was becoming the path that brought vulnerable women closer to a property most of them did not truly know, owned by a man police would not fully understand until years too late. By the late 1970s, the Pickton farm changed again because the people who had controlled it were gone. Robert's father, Leonard Francis Pickton, died first. Then his mother, Louise Helene Arnall Pickton, also died. For Robert, David, and Linda, the farm was no longer simply the place where they had grown up under their parents' rules. It was now an inheritance, a business, and a large piece of land sitting in a growing part of British Columbia. Robert stayed close to it because that was what he knew. David moved in and out of the same world, but he also had his own business interests, including work connected to demolition and salvage. But Port Coquitlam was changing. Land that had once been useful mainly for farming had become attractive to developers, and by the 1990s, the Pickton property that was about 30 acres had become valuable. So the siblings began selling pieces of it. Parts of the family land were sold to developers for more than 5 million Canadian dollars, and that money changed everything. The farm became smaller, but the Picktons became wealthier. Then in 1996, Robert Pickton and his brother David gave the farm a new name. They registered something called Piggy's Palace Good Time Society. It was supposed to organize, coordinate, manage, and operate special events, dances, shows, exhibitions, and functions for service organizations, sports groups, and other worthy causes. In simple words, it was presented as a community-style event society, the kind of thing that could host gatherings, raise money, and give the farm a public-facing purpose beyond pigs and livestock. But that was the version on paper. It became a party spot. People came out to Port Coquitlam in large numbers, sometimes by the hundreds, and as high as 1,700 to 2,000 people on busy nights. There were live bands, drinking, drugs, and bikers. Hells Angels members, local business people, and city officials, and even policemen were regulars. So, women from the downtown Eastside could be brought out to the farm under the cover of a party, a good time, free drinks, money, drugs, or a ride away from the street for a few hours. Robert could blend his private life with the public chaos around him. Then one woman came to that farm with Robert Pickton, but she made it back out alive. In March 1997, a woman named Wendy Lynn Eistetter got into Robert Pickton's vehicle and went with him to the farm in Port Coquitlam. Wendy was a sex worker, and Pickton had offered her money and drugs. They drove away from Vancouver and headed toward the Pickton property. Then Wendy went into his trailer. Inside, the space was small, dirty, and uncomfortable, but she had dealt with strange men and strange rooms before. At first, the night seemed like another paid encounter, the kind of situation she had entered many times while trying to survive on the street. Then Pickton's behavior changed. He brought out handcuffs and tried to restrain her. Wendy understood quickly that this was no longer just an encounter she could finish and leave. She fought back immediately. She kicked, pushed, and tried to get away from him, and the struggle moved through the trailer as both of them grabbed for anything they could use to protect themselves or gain control. It became chaotic. Wendy managed to get to the kitchen area and picked a knife, while Pickton had a butcher's knife. And during the struggle, both she and Pickton were injured. She later had serious wounds, and Pickton was also badly hurt, but Wendy kept fighting because she knew stopping was not an option. The trailer was isolated enough that nobody was standing outside ready to help her. If she did not get herself out, she might not leave that farm at all. So she kept moving. She got away from him and made it out of the trailer. Then she ran. She made it from the property to the road, injured, shaken, and still trying to survive what had just happened. An older couple saw her and helped her. They took her to hospital, and when she arrived, medical staff could see that she had come from something serious. She was hurt, frightened, and still connected to the scene in one detail police could not ignore: the handcuffs. Wendy told police that Pickton had the keys, and then the case took an almost unbelievable turn because Pickton also ended up at a hospital that same night. He had gone for treatment after the struggle, and when hospital staff checked him, a key was found in his pocket. That key fit the handcuffs on Wendy. At that moment, the police had more than a rumor. They had a survivor. They had a direct link between Wendy and Robert Pickton's trailer. Pickton was arrested and charged with attempted murder, unlawful confinement, and aggravated assault. For the first time, the system had a clear chance to stop him.
I don't smoke, I don't use drugs, and then everybody says, how come your eyes are so bloodshot? I says, I turned around, I didn't take the knife away from her. I did not take the knife away from her. I aimed it to her and I knifed her twice. I did that. I admit I did that. That's one thing I shouldn't have done.
You've never taken any of the prostitutes back to your trailer?
Not since this incident, no. Hey.
But before that incident?
No.
But the case did not hold. Wendy was afraid, unstable, and dealing with addiction. Prosecutors believed she would not be strong enough as a witness to secure a conviction, and when the case moved toward court in January 1998, she did not testify. Without her, the prosecution weakened and the charges were stayed. Pickton walked away from that case. He went back to the farm. And the part that became even harder to accept later was that police kept the clothing and rubber boots he had worn during that 1997 incident. Those items sat in evidence storage for years. Then, after the farm search in 2002, testing would connect those same items to DNA from 2 other missing women. So the warning had been there long before the big search. And although Wendy survived, other women kept disappearing. By August 1997, Robert Pickton had already returned to the low track enough times to understand how the nights worked. That was where Marnie Frey came into the story. Marnie was 24 years old. People who knew her described her as kind, selfless, and loyal, the kind of person who could still show warmth even while her own life was falling apart. But she had been exposed to drugs early, and over time, addiction pulled her deeper into the same streets where so many women were already at risk. Before she disappeared, Marnie spoke with her stepmother on the phone. They talked about her birthday and about sending her a care package, and before the call ended, they exchanged, "I love you." After that, her family never heard from her again. That night, Marnie was around the low track, looking for heroin and trying to get through the hours ahead. Pickton came through like he had done before. And when he promised to give her heroin if she came with him, Marnie agreed, so she got into his vehicle. But once they were inside the trailer, everything changed. Marnie asked for what he had promised, and then she saw the look on his face. The promise had been a lie. Then the night turned against her. Pickton shoved Marnie onto the bed and used a rope to take control before she could break away. She fought him, but he tightened the rope and kept his grip until Marnie could no longer fight back. Then he did what made this case different from an ordinary disappearance. He dragged her from the trailer to the slaughterhouse area. Then he cut her remains down and moved them through the farm's disposal system. Some experts believed he placed them in animal waste barrels and took them to West Coast Reduction, the same rendering facility he already visited as part of his farm work. Others believed he fed her to the pigs on the property. Whichever version was true, the outcome was the same. Her stepmother contacted police several times, trying to report that something was wrong, but the response moved slowly. A proper missing person report was not filed quickly enough, and for months, Marnie's disappearance sat inside the same delay that had already affected other women from the downtown Eastside. Between 1995 and 1997, 21 women disappeared from the low track, and Pickton kept returning to the same streets like it had become part of his routine. Once they were on his farm, the act changed. He used lies and manipulation to get control, and then he turned that control into violence. Afterward, he used the same butcher's skills and farm disposal systems he had known for years to cut the victims apart and hide what was left. To Pickton, it was not just about killing, it was about power. He had spent most of his life feeling awkward, weak, and rejected, but on that farm, with vulnerable women trapped inside his world, he finally felt in control, and once he found that feeling, he kept going back to the low track for more. Then in April 1998, the fear around the downtown Eastside was literally eating everybody up. And that was when Sarah DeVries disappeared. Sarah was around the Crack Shack, a known pickup spot in the downtown Eastside where women met clients, friends crossed paths, and people moved in and out through the night. It was not a safe place, but it was familiar to the women who worked around it. That night, Sarah was there with a friend. They were both out in the area, and at some point, Sarah's friend left with a client. In that world, nobody immediately panicked when someone left for a date, because women came and went all night. A friend could disappear for a short while, return later, move to another corner, or show up at a nearby room. So at first, Sarah being out of sight did not automatically mean the worst had happened. But when her friend came back, Sarah was still gone. Then she noticed the purse. Sarah's purse had been left behind. And for people who did not understand life on those streets, that detail might have sounded small. But for the women who lived that life, it said a lot. A purse was not just something you carried because it matched your outfit. It held what a woman needed to get through the night. It could hold money, ID, cigarettes, makeup, numbers, small personal things, and anything else that helped her move, work, and return. It was not something Sarah would normally leave behind if she had simply walked away by choice. So, the waiting began. Maybe Sarah had gone around the corner. Maybe she had taken a quick date and would come back for it. Maybe she had left in a rush. But time passed, and Sarah did not return. The worry moved quickly from the street to the people who cared about her. Her ex-boyfriend and friends started asking where she was. Her family wanted answers. Her sister, Maggie DeVries, refused to accept that Sarah had simply disappeared into the background. Maggie knew Sarah had struggles, but she also knew Sarah had people who loved her and people she stayed connected to. A hard life did not mean a person stopped mattering. Wayne Ling, Sarah's friend and former client, also pushed for attention, so when she vanished, he did not treat it like a normal absence, and they reported it to the police. But the response they received was not the response they believed Sarah deserved. The same explanations came up again. Maybe Sarah had left town, maybe she was avoiding contact, maybe she was caught up in drugs, maybe she would come back when she was ready. Those explanations had been used before with other missing women from the downtown Eastside, but Sarah did not come back. So for a long time, the women had been warning each other in the ways they knew how. They talked about bad dates, they repeated descriptions of men who made them uncomfortable, they watched cars that came through too often, they noticed when a woman did not come back, and they remembered the places where she had last been seen. But outside that world, the story was still not landing with enough force. Then Sarah's disappearance reached a journalist named Lindsay Kyness. Sarah's loved ones were frustrated because they felt the missing women were not being treated with the urgency they deserved. So when the story reached Lindsay, it gave the case something it badly needed: public attention. He began writing about the women who had disappeared from Vancouver's downtown Eastside. And the articles did what private warnings had not been able to do on their own. They pushed the disappearances into the open. Now people outside the low track were reading about it. They were seeing names, numbers, and families asking why their daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends could disappear from the same part of the city without a clear answer. And once those stories were printed, the pressure started to grow. The push for a reward also gained strength, as high as $100,000. But by 1998, 9 more women had disappeared from the streets of Vancouver, and the response still did not match the fear spreading through the downtown Eastside. When friends and families tried to report the missing, they were often met with the same dismissive explanation. Women like them sometimes got on a bus, left town, and came back when they wanted. By July 1998, the missing women case had reached the desk of Detective Constable Lori Shenher. She was with the Vancouver Police Department, and she was assigned to focus on the women who had disappeared from the downtown East Side. So Lori started doing what the system should have done earlier. She looked closely at the women. Then she put that concern into words with a line that should have changed the temperature of the investigation. These cases are related and should be treated as such. Then there was Detective Inspector Kim Rossmo. Rossmo was a geographic profiler, and his work pointed in the same direction Lori was already seeing. He looked at the disappearances, the locations, the numbers, and the pattern, and his analysis suggested that a serial offender was likely active. But senior police leadership did not fully accept the serial killer theory quickly enough. There were no bodies in many of the cases, and without bodies, some decision-makers hesitated to call the disappearances murders. And there was another problem. The case did not sit neatly inside one police department. The women were disappearing from Vancouver, so the Vancouver Police Department carried the pressure from families, advocates, and the downtown East Side. But Robert Pickton's farm was in Port Coquitlam, where the RCMP had jurisdiction. So even when Pickton's name entered the conversation, Vancouver police could not simply march onto the farm and search it. They needed cooperation, warrants, direct evidence, and a clear investigative bridge between the city where women vanished and the property where suspicion was starting to point. And that gap slowed everything down. Then, one night in 1999, Lynn Ellingson, his friend, was inside Robert Pickton's trailer. Lynn knew Pickton. She had spent time around the farm, and for a while, she had been close enough to see the way people moved in and out of his property. She was also struggling with addiction. Earlier that night, Lynn and Pickton had gone into Vancouver. Pickton picked up a woman that night. Her name was Georgina Faith Papine, a mother of 7 children. They drove back to Port Coquitlam, and when they reached the farm, Pickton took Georgina into one part of the trailer while Lynn stayed in another area. Lynn got high, settled onto the couch, and eventually fell asleep. Then later that night, something woke her, and she realized that Pickton was not inside. Lynn looked around, trying to understand what had pulled her out of sleep, and then she noticed light coming from the slaughterhouse area. It was late, the farm was still, and yet one of the buildings was lit up like someone was working. She got up and stepped outside, and as she crossed the field toward the slaughterhouse, she began hearing a sound from inside. It sounded like metal hitting wood again and again. Then she reached the building and looked inside. Pickton was there. He was working near one of the tables, moving with the focus of a man doing something he knew how to do. At first glance, it could have looked like ordinary farm work, the kind of late-night butchering that might happen on a pig farm. But then Lynn saw enough to understand that this was not an animal. The woman from earlier that night was there, Georgina. For a moment, Lynn could not process what she was seeing. Then he saw Lynn at the doorway. Pickton came toward her, grabbed her by the wrist, and pulled her closer before she could back away. Lynn tried not to look. She tried to shut out what was in front of her, but Pickton forced her attention back to the scene, as if he wanted her to understand exactly what he had done and exactly what he was capable of doing. Then he leaned in and whispered the line Lynn would later repeat. He compared Georgina to a pig. And at that moment, Lynn believed she was next. But he did not kill her. Instead, he let her leave. He paid for a cab and sent her back to Vancouver, and as Lynn got into that cab, she carried more than fear with her. Now she knew that he was the reason some of them never came back. When Lynn returned to Vancouver, she thought about going to the police, but fear took over. So instead of walking into a police station and telling everything clearly, she hid. She stayed away from him. She tried to survive with what she knew, but secrets like that do not stay buried forever. The story began moving through other people. Lynn told pieces of it. Others heard about it. Eventually, the information reached investigators, but by then the lead had already become difficult. When police questioned Lynn, she did not give them the steady, direct statement they needed. Some investigators believed her denial weakened the lead. Others believed the first version was too serious to dismiss, especially because other people had heard Lynn talk about what she saw before police ever got involved. So once again, the investigation came close to the farm, and once again, it did not break through. By February 1999, Brenda Ann Wolfe entered his path. Brenda was a young Indigenous woman, and she was known in the downtown Eastside for more than her struggles. She had fought addiction, and her family believed she may have been living with mental health challenges, but people around the low track also knew her as someone with a strong presence. She worked in a local eatery, and on the street she had a reputation as someone who could stand up for others when trouble came. If someone had a problem with dangerous people in the neighborhood, Brenda was the kind of person who might step in and help sort it out. She was not mainly known as a sex worker. But when she relapsed, money and drugs became pressure points, and Pickton knew how to press on those exact needs. That night, he pulled up in his pickup truck and found Brenda looking for drugs. He told her what he had told other women before her. He said he could get her what she needed if she came back to his trailer. To Brenda, the offer may have looked ugly, but useful. She needed a fix, and he was offering a way to get it. So she went with him. The drive took them out of Vancouver and back to the farm, back to the dirty trailer where Pickton had brought other women before her. Inside, the place looked and smelled like the rest of his life. Mud clung to the floor. Dirty dishes sat piled in the sink. The air carried the smell of animals, sweat, and old farms. It was not welcoming, but Brenda was not there for comfort. She was there because Pickton had made a promise. When the encounter was over, Brenda expected him to keep his word. But Pickton's mood had changed. She looked at him and realized the promise had never been the point. The drugs had only been the bait. He wanted control, and now that she was inside his trailer, the strange farmer from the street was no longer acting harmless. Brenda started gathering her clothes, trying to move toward the end of the night, but Pickton moved first. He forced her back onto the bed and restrained her before she could get free. Brenda tried to fight him off, but he used his weight and the space around him to keep control. The trailer became a trap, and the woman who had been known for standing up to dangerous people was suddenly trapped with a man who had built his whole routine around catching women when they were alone. He held her down until she could no longer fight. Then he moved her from the trailer toward the farm buildings, where the full danger of his world became clear. Pickton was not just a man hiding a crime in a room. After Brenda was gone, he used the farm the way he knew how to use it. He moved her through the same private system that had helped him hide what happened to other women. The slaughterhouse area, the disposal routines, and the ordinary mess of the property all became part of how he covered his tracks. By the time anyone outside the farm understood what had happened, Brenda had vanished from the streets of Vancouver like so many before her. As the disappearances spread through the downtown Eastside, the fear began changing the way women moved. The shelters were talking, the streets were talking. Women were becoming more careful about which cars they entered and which men they trusted. The old routine was no longer working as easily for Pickton, because by then, too many women had disappeared, and too many people were asking why. So he adjusted. If women were becoming more cautious around men, then he needed someone who could make the invitation feel safer. That was where Dinah Taylor entered the story. Dinah was known around the Eastside as the Witch of Endor, and she became one of the women in Pickton's circle. She knew the low track, she knew the shelters, she knew how to speak to women who were tired, desperate, suspicious, or looking for a way to get through the next few hours. And because she was a woman from that same world, she could get close in a way Pickton could not. Some women might take money from him, but others were beginning to hesitate. Dinah helped soften that hesitation. She would go into shelters and talk to vulnerable women. She would tell them about Pickton as if he was harmless, almost generous. And to a woman who was already tired from the street, that kind of invitation could sound different coming from Dinah. A man making the offer might feel dangerous. A woman making the offer could feel like a bridge. And once women reached the property, the mask could fall. Pickton began using a different kind of manipulation. Instead of always turning violent without warning, he would sometimes accuse the women of stealing from him. It gave him an excuse to build anger. It made the scene feel like an argument instead of a trap. The women would deny it, explain themselves, plead with him, or try to calm him down. But by then, they were already on his land, inside his space, and surrounded by a farm he controlled completely. The accusation was never really about stolen money or missing items. It was a way to start the violence on his terms. And while all of this was happening, the missing women numbers kept climbing. So in 2001, the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP finally moved into a joint effort known as Project Even-Handed, the task force built to investigate the missing women. They offered rewards for information that could lead to an arrest. Then the phone lines started filling. Thousands of tips came in from locals, friends, street workers, people around the downtown Eastside, and people who had heard things they were no longer willing to keep quiet. Some tips were weak, some were rumors, some pointed in the wrong direction, but a handful of callers gave the same kind of name: Willie Pickton, the pig farmer east of Vancouver. His name was added to the suspect list, partly because of his past assault charge, and partly because too many pieces around him were beginning to line up. But the investigation was still fighting itself. Police had thousands of tips, but the records were messy. They had names, but not enough direct evidence. On another night in the low track, a woman known as Lenore stumbled through the street, drunk, unsteady, and trying to make her way through a part of Vancouver where danger could appear as a friendly voice from a rolled-down window. Lenore was Indigenous and had come from Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island. Her childhood had been unstable, and by the time she was older, alcohol had become one of the ways she carried what had happened to her. So that night, when a white van pulled up beside her and a man offered her a ride, she was not thinking with the sharpness she might have had on a clearer night. The driver wore a baseball cap. and in the dark, she could not see his face properly. His voice sounded calm enough. He seemed friendly enough. He said he could take her where she needed to go, and because she was tired, drunk, and alone, she got in. But as soon as she entered the van, something felt wrong. The back seats had been removed. The inside smelled strange, like bleach and something metallic underneath it. Lenore sat there, trying to make sense of the feeling rising in her stomach, and then she looked over at the man behind the wheel. His face was still partly hidden, but now she could see enough to know she did not want to be in that van anymore. She told him to drop her off, but he did not stop. She tried again, telling him she wanted to go home, but he kept driving like he had not heard her. Then he said he would take her to a park, and that was when the fear became clear. Lenore knew better than to give him her real address, so she told him to let her out near Commercial Drive and said she would walk the rest of the way. But the van kept moving. At that point, Lenore stopped waiting for him to make the right decision and made one for herself. She reached for the door handle while the vehicle was still moving, pulled the door open, and threw herself out onto the road. She hit the ground hard, but she got up fast. Behind her, the van slowed down. Then it turned. The driver was coming back. Lenore ran. She cut away from the street, ducked into an alley, moved between buildings, and kept going until she found people. Then she blended into the group and stayed there long enough to make sure the van was gone. A week later, when she saw reports about more missing women on the news, she understood how close she had come. She could have become another name on the list. And while women like Lenore were escaping by instinct, Pickton's usual methods were becoming harder to use. By June 2001, Dinah brought 22-year-old Andrea Josbury from the Roosevelt Hotel, where Andrea was living at the time. Andrea went to the farm, and once she was there, the night turned in a different way from some of the earlier cases. Pickton did not follow the same pattern. Andrea was killed by a gunshot, and because Dinah had been tied to how Andrea reached the property, questions later followed her role in what happened that night. A few months later, Serena Abbotsway was brought to the farm. Serena was 29 years old, and her name would later become one of the most important names in the entire investigation, because when police finally entered Pickton's trailer in February 2002, they found her asthma inhaler. But before that discovery, before the search warrant, before the farm was sealed, Serena was another woman taken into Pickton's world and never returned to the people who knew her. Andrea and Serena marked a dangerous change in Pickton's behavior. He was no longer cleaning up as quickly or as carefully as before. Parts of evidence connected to the women were kept on the property, including in containers stored in a freezer. Whether he kept them because he felt untouchable, careless, or in control, the effect was the same. And while that evidence sat there, Pickton went hunting again. By November 2001, he was back in Vancouver, this time near Main Street and West Hastings Street, where he encountered 26-year-old Mona Wilson. He promised her drugs and alcohol if she came with him, and Mona got into his van. But he did not take her to the trailer. He took her to a camper van parked behind a barn on the farm. The camper was not much better than the trailer. It carried the same dirty farm atmosphere, the same sense of isolation, and the same control Pickton seemed to need. But it had what he wanted: a bed and enough privacy to act without interruption. After Mona realized the situation was turning against her, she fought back. She was stronger than he expected. When he tried to restrain her, she resisted. He pinned her down, but she would not give in easily, and for a moment, the control he depended on began to slip. So Pickton reached for a gun. Mona was shot inside the camper, but the breakthrough did not come the way the families expected. It did not come because police finally built a perfect missing women case against Pickton. It came through something smaller, simpler, and easier to act on: guns. In early February 2002, a man named Scott Chubb stepped into the story. He was not a grieving family member. He was not a journalist. He had worked around the Pickton family as a truck driver, and he gave police the kind of direct information they had been missing for years. He told the Coquitlam RCMP that he had personally seen illegal weapons inside Robert Pickton's trailer. So the police prepared the warrant. On February 5, 2002, police finally drove onto Robert Pickton's farm, and the search that began that day did not begin as a murder investigation. They were there for illegal weapons, so they entered the property and started searching for guns. At first, they found exactly what the warrant allowed them to look for. Weapons were inside the trailer. That alone gave police a reason to arrest Pickton, and for a moment, the search still looked like a weapons case. Then an officer saw something on the floor. It was an inhaler. By itself, it did not look like the kind of object that would stop a search cold. It was small, ordinary, and easy to miss in the clutter of a filthy trailer. But when police checked the name attached to it, everything changed. The name was Serena Abotsway. Serena was one of the missing women from the downtown Eastside. At that moment, the officers were no longer standing inside a trailer with illegal firearms. They were standing inside the trailer of a man whose name had been tied to the missing women investigation for years, and now an item belonging to one of those women was right there in front of them. The search had to stop. They could not keep moving through the property under a weapons warrant while the evidence in front of them was now pointing towards something much larger. So police arrested Pickton, halted the firearms search, and began the process of securing the property for a new warrant. Pickton spent that first night in custody while the farm became the center of a case that was about to explode across Canada. By morning, news crews were gathering near the edge of the property. Police cars and trucks rolled through the mud. Officers moved around barns, trailers, vehicles, and farm buildings. And across Vancouver, people who had watched the missing women's story grow for years were now seeing Robert Pickton's face on television. For Lenore, the woman who had escaped from the white van, that face was not just another suspect on the news. It was the man she recognized. The man in the baseball cap. The man who had offered her a ride. The man who kept driving after she told him to stop. As she watched the reports, the weight of what had almost happened to her became clear. She had not simply escaped a bad ride. She had escaped a man police now believed was connected to the women disappearing from the same streets she had walked. Back at the farm, the search expanded. Investigators were no longer looking at one trailer. They were looking at a full property. Barns, vehicles, storage areas, animal pens, equipment, mud, waste, and buildings that had been part of Pickton's private world for years. The farm was no longer just a place police had heard about in tips. It was now the crime scene, and the items they began finding made the case darker with every step. They found handcuffs, a revolver, and items connected to sexual violence. They found a syringe containing a blue liquid. They found a Spanish fly, an aphrodisiac. And then investigators moved toward the camper van behind the barn. That camper became one of the key places tied to Mona Wilson. Inside, police found signs of a violent struggle and evidence that connected Mona to the vehicle. The walls, bedding, and carpet told investigators that whatever happened inside that camper had not been minor, and it had not been cleaned away well enough to hide it forever. Outside the camper, they found more evidence connected to her. The details were difficult even for experienced investigators to process, but the basic truth was clear. Mona Wilson had not simply vanished from Vancouver. Evidence of what happened to her was sitting on Pickton's farm. But that was only the beginning. And within days, Robert Pickton's property was no longer just a pig farm in Port Coquitlam. It became one of the largest crime scenes Canada had ever seen. The problem was the size of it. This was not one room, one vehicle, or one small area that could be taped off and processed in a few hours. It was a working farm with trailers, barns, vehicles, freezers, equipment, outbuildings, mud, animals, waste areas, and years of activity spread across the land. So the farm was sealed and the work began. Then they moved outside and began breaking the property into sections because the land itself had to be searched carefully. Soil had to be examined, areas had to be marked, evidence had to be logged, protected, tested, and connected back to names that families had been saying for years. And because the farm environment made everything harder, police brought in specialists. Forensic experts came in, archaeologists and DNA specialists came in. The investigation would eventually cost tens of millions of dollars, and the number of exhibits became massive. Some of that evidence connected directly to the 6 women who would later be named at trial. Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Ann Wolfe, Georgina Faith Papin, and Marnie Frey. But inside the investigation, there was another problem. Finding evidence was one thing. Proving exactly what happened, to whom, and when was another. The farm had too many people moving through it over the years. Piggy's Palace had brought crowds onto the property. Workers, guests, friends, partygoers, and associates had all been there at different times. That meant investigators were not only collecting evidence, they were trying to separate years of ordinary activity from evidence that could support murder charges in court. So the search became slow, and the case became bigger. And the more names appeared, the clearer it became that the story could not be contained by the first warrant, the first arrest, or even the first charges. By then, police already had enough to move against Robert Pickton again. He had been arrested during the weapons search, released on bail, and kept away from the farm while officers continued working the property. So, on February 22, 2002, police arrested him again. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Serena Abotsway and Mona Wilson. However, even with the arrest, police still needed to know what Pickton would say when he thought no one official was asking. In a formal interview, a suspect could deny everything. He could stay quiet. He could give short answers. And Pickton, by then, had already shown that he was not going to sit across from investigators and simply explain what had happened. So the police tried another strategy. They placed him in a cell with an undercover RCMP officer who posed as another detainee. To Pickton, the man was supposed to look like someone in the same situation, someone he could talk to without the pressure of a police interview room. But the conversation was being recorded, and every word mattered. At first, the exchange moved like ordinary jail talk. The undercover officer had to gain his trust, keep him speaking, and let the conversation unfold naturally. But then Pickton began saying things that changed the weight of the case. He allegedly told the undercover officer that he had killed 49 women, and he said he had wanted to make it an even 50. It seemed to confirm what many people had feared for years. The case was much bigger than the first 2 charges, much bigger than 1 search warrant, and much bigger than the 6 convictions that would eventually come. 49.
Really? That's what I was stopping people for. Yeah. Make a big battle. Make a big fight. That's fuck. You gotta get 40 people to list. And have all the list. I'm gonna have the people. The other half of I love it. So they got to be they can't even put a name to it. How the fuck does that help you? That helps you? Yeah. Right? It looks good on you. You feel the streets with antifreeze, and you inject yourself, and you're dead better than 10 minutes. Why the hell did you do that? Bigger than the ladies, bigger than the months in the States. Yeah. Oh yeah, fucking my
But even then, police still had to prove each case in court. They could not build a prosecution on fear alone. They could not charge every disappearance just because Pickton had said something in a cell. They needed evidence, names, timelines, forensic links, witness statements, and legal proof strong enough to survive a trial. So while that recording became one of the most chilling pieces of the investigation, it did not end the work. The farm search continued. The forensic testing continued. More names were reviewed. More charges were prepared. And as the case moved forward, investigators were no longer asking whether Robert Pickton's farm mattered. They were asking how many women it could explain. By 2005, the case had grown into one of the largest criminal prosecutions Canada had ever seen, and Pickton was facing dozens of murder charges connected to women who had disappeared from Vancouver's downtown Eastside. So, by the time the court process began, it was already clear that this was not going to be a simple trial. In 2006, Justice James Williams, the British Columbia Supreme Court judge, had to decide how the case would be heard. Pickton had been charged with many counts of first-degree murder, But if all of those counts went before one jury at the same time, the trial could stretch for years. The evidence could become overwhelming. The jury could struggle to keep each count separate, and if the process became too heavy, there was a real risk of a mistrial. So Justice Williams made a major decision. He severed the charges. The first trial would deal with 6 women, and the remaining charges would be left for a possible second trial later. And that first part began in January 2007. The 6 women at the center of the trial were Marnie Frey, Serena Abbotsway, Georgina Faith Papin, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Wolfe, and Mona Wilson. Prosecutors argued that Pickton was responsible for the deaths of these women, and they built their case around the evidence found on the farm, the forensic links, witness testimony, and his own recorded statements. But the defense fought back by attacking the certainty of that story. They argued that the farm had not been a quiet, private space where only Pickton moved around. It has been busy. People came and went. Piggy's Palace had brought crowds to the property. Workers, friends, partygoers, and associates had been there over the years. So the defense tried to create doubt by saying the evidence did not prove Pickton acted alone, or even that he was the only person responsible. They also challenged key witnesses. Lynn Ellingson became one of the most important and complicated figures in the courtroom. She had been connected to one of the earlier claims about seeing something disturbing at the farm, but her credibility was attacked because of her drug use, her changing statements, and her own connection to Pickton's world. The defense also raised questions about Pickton himself. They pointed to his low intelligence. They questioned whether his recorded statements in the jail cell were real admissions or whether he had been exaggerating to impress someone he thought was another inmate. They tried to show the jury that the farm was chaotic, the people around Pickton were unreliable, and the evidence did not answer every question clearly enough for first-degree murder. And that was where the trial became more complicated than many families expected. During deliberations, the jury asked whether Pickton could still be found guilty if he was not the only person involved. That question mattered because it showed that the jurors were thinking carefully about the possibility of other people, other actions, and different routes to responsibility. And for the family sitting through the trial, that must have been difficult to hear. Then on December 9th, 2007, the jury returned. Robert Pickton was found not guilty of first-degree murder on all 6 counts, but he was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict meant the jury believed he was criminally responsible for the deaths of Marnie Frey, Serena Abbotsway, Georgina Faith Papin, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Wolfe, and Mona Wilson. But it also meant the jury had not accepted the full first-degree murder case as charged. For some families, there was relief because there was finally a conviction. For others, there was pain because the verdict still left unanswered questions. And for many people watching the case, the second-degree conviction created a difficult feeling. Pickton had been held responsible, but the trial had not fully explained everything. 2 days later, on December 11th, 2007, Justice Williams sentenced him. Pickton received life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum parole ineligibility period available for second-degree murder. And when Justice Williams addressed the court, he did not pretend the trial had revealed every detail. He said, "Mr. Pickton's conduct was murderous and repeatedly so. I cannot know the details, but I know this. What happened to them was senseless and despicable." That sentence captured the strange weight of the case. But even as Pickton was led into a life sentence, the larger case was still unfinished because 20 other charges remained, and many families were still waiting to know whether their loved ones would ever have their day in court. After the sentence, Robert Pickton's legal fight did not end. His lawyers appealed the convictions, and the case moved from the trial court to the British Columbia Court of Appeal. The defense argued that mistakes had been made during the trial, especially around the judge's instructions to the jury, the way certain evidence was handled, and how the jury was allowed to think about Pickton's role if other people had also been involved. Then prosecutors had wanted the first-degree murder acquittals reviewed, and they also challenged some of the trial decisions that had limited how the case was presented. So even after Pickton had been convicted, the legal arguments continued on both sides. And for the families, that meant the case still had no clean ending. Then the case reached the Supreme Court of Canada. In 2010, the Supreme Court upheld Pickton's convictions. The court rejected the argument that he should receive a new trial, and the 6 second-degree murder convictions remained in place. For the 6 families tied to those convictions, that ruling meant the verdicts were secure. But almost immediately, another decision brought the pain back for many others. The remaining 20 murder charges were stayed. That meant they would not go to trial. The Crown's reasoning was practical in a legal sense. Pickton was already serving life in prison with no parole eligibility for 25 years, which was the maximum parole ineligibility period he could receive. Even if he was convicted on more counts, prosecutors said it would not add more time to his sentence. But for many families, that answer did not feel like justice, because for them, the second trial was never only about adding years to Pickton's sentence. It was about having their loved one's name spoken in court. It was about a public record. It was about evidence being heard, witnesses being questioned, and a jury being asked to make a decision. It was about the chance to stand in a courtroom and say what that loss had done to their family. Without a second trial, there would be no verdict for those women. There would be no full public telling of their cases. There would be no victim impact statements in the same way the first 6 families had been allowed to speak. And for some families, their loved ones remained trapped in the legal system as names attached to charges that were filed, delayed, and then quietly stopped. Some relatives were relieved because they did not want to sit through another long and painful trial. After everything they had already endured, another trial would have forced families to hear difficult evidence again and live through years of court delays. That was one of the strongest criticisms raised by legal scholar Elaine Craig. She argued that the Pickton trial punished the accused, but it did not produce a full truth account. It did not fully show who the women were beyond the labels often attached to them, and it did not give all families the same chance to have their loved one's story heard in court. After the convictions were upheld and the remaining charges were stayed, the legal case had reached the point where the courts could not give families much more. But the public questions were still there. How had so many women disappeared from the same community? Why had families and advocates struggled for years to be heard? Why had the 1997 case involving Wendy Lynn Eistetter been dropped, even though it later became one of the clearest missed warnings in the entire story? And why had police forces working across Vancouver and Port Coquitlam failed to move quickly enough when Robert Pickton's name had already appeared in tips and reports? So in 2010, British Columbia created the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, led by Wally Opal. The inquiry was not a second trial, and it was not there to decide again whether Pickton was guilty. Its job was to look at the system around the case, the police decisions, the Crown decision in 1998, the missing person investigations, and the way different agencies handled information while women continued to vanish. In 2012, the final report came out. It was called Forsaken, and its findings were painful. The inquiry described blatant failures in the way the cases had been handled, and it called the result a tragedy of epic proportions. Those were words from an official public inquiry looking back at years of missed warnings, poor coordination, weak urgency, and bias against women who were already living on the margins. The report made 63 recommendations. It called for better missing person investigations, stronger police cooperation, improved support for vulnerable women, and more attention to the families who had spent years asking for answers. But even the inquiry itself was criticized because some families and community groups felt the process had not fully included the people most affected. Still, one thing could no longer be denied. The women had not only been failed by one man, they had been failed by systems that should have responded sooner. The Vancouver Police Department later apologized. Deputy Chief Constable Doug Lepard said he wished, from the bottom of his heart, that police had caught Pickton sooner. He said he wished the agencies involved had done better, that the mistakes could be undone, and that more lives could have been saved. But those words came after the damage had already been done. Robert Pickton spent the rest of his life in prison. In 2024, he was attacked by another inmate, and he later died in hospital.
This is what's left of Robert Pickton's notorious pig farm. remnants of the pain he caused, tributes to the women he killed. The serial killer was attacked by another inmate in prison earlier this month. The Vancouver Sun reports Pickton was stabbed in the head with a broken broom handle. For some victims' families, there is now closure, even joy.
A relief and just happy. To be honest, I jumped up and down.
Tammy Lynn Papin's sister Georgina's DNA was found on Pickton's pig farm, along with the remains or DNA of 32 other women.
It was only her left hand, the bones of her left hand.
In 2007, Pickton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Official justice likely for only some of his victims. He had bragged to an undercover police officer he had killed 49 women.
Those families are reliving that now, and they're the ones who should be remembered, not the serial killer who committed those crimes.
Justice took too long. The conviction came a full decade after reports workers, many Indigenous, were disappearing from Vancouver's downtown Eastside. Investigations were botched. A commission later blamed systemic bias and fragmented policing.
Obviously, his legacy is one of horrible notoriety and the innocent suffering, the devastation that he caused so many innocent people.
Pickton's brutality and the failure to stop it sooner forced Canadians to reflect on how our institutions treat the vulnerable, especially Indigenous women, a reckoning still unfolding.
Now, if any vulnerable person goes missing, the police have an obligation, a legal obligation, to do an investigation and to report back to the families.
Police and prison officials are investigating the attack on Pickton, a brutal end for a man with a brutal legacy. Lindsay Duncombe, CBC News, Vancouver.
But that was not where this story should end, because the case never truly belonged to Robert Pickton. It was about the women whose lives were cut short, the families who kept asking questions, and the community that knew something was wrong long before the country was forced to look. Pickton was convicted for 6 women: Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Joesbury, Brenda Ann Wolfe, Georgina Faith Papin, and Marnie Frey. But there were other names tied to charges that never went to trial. Jacqueline Michelle McDonnell, Diane Rosemary Rock, Heather Kathleen Bottomley, Jennifer Lynn Firminger, Helen May Hallmark, Patricia Rose Johnson, Heather Gabrielle Chinnock, Tanya Hullock, Sherry Lee Irving, Inga Monique Hall, Tiffany Louise Drew, Sarah John DeVries, Cynthia Cindy Felix, Angela Rebecca Jardine, Diana Melnick, Deborah Lynn Jones, Wendy Crawford, Carrie Lynn Koski, Andrea Faye Borehaven, Cara Louise Ellis, and Mission Jane Doe. There were also women whose names appeared around the wider investigation, even though Pickton was not convicted in their cases: Marianne Clark, Stephanie Lane, Dawn, Teresa Cray, Yvonne Marie Bowen. Behind every name was a life, a family, a history, a person who should not have had to be perfect to be protected. And that is what made this case so painful. And it belonged to the question Canada was forced to face after years of looking away. How many lives could have been saved if the warnings had mattered sooner?